Attachment styles. Why you attract the same people. We often find ourselves drawn to people who mirror our emotional patterns, to relationships that feel all too familiar, even when we swear we want something different. There's a quiet mystery in the way we seem to attract the same type of person over and over again. The ones who leave us feeling the same pain, the same heartbreak, the same emotional exhaustion. But what if this repetition isn't random? What if it's not just a coincidence? What if it's because of the attachment style we carry deep within us, the invisible blueprint that shapes how we connect with others, how we love, how we seek, how we protect ourselves? This is the journey into understanding attachment styles, and why, despite our best efforts, we often find ourselves attracting the same people, the same patterns, time and time again. We often find ourselves drawn to the same types of people, even when we think we want something different. It's a quiet paradox that we can spend so much of our time hoping for change, dreaming of a new kind of connection, only to find ourselves repeating the same relational patterns. The faces may change, the names may be different, but the emotional dynamics feel eerily familiar. Perhaps it's the person who pulls away when you get too close, or the one who demands all your attention but never quite reciprocates it. Maybe it's the person who seems so perfect at first, but over time, their true colors start to show. The subtle emotional unavailability, the withdrawal, the unpredictability. No matter how many times you vow that next time will be different, you find yourself again and again in the same situation, the same patterns, the same disappointment, the same emotional exhaustion. But what if this isn't a coincidence? What if the reason you are consistently drawn to these relationships isn't because of bad luck, or because you're simply not good enough to attract something better? What if it's because of something far deeper, a silent pull rooted in the way you attach to others? What if your attachment style, the invisible blueprint that formed in your early years, is guiding you toward the very relationships that echo the ones you experienced as a child? Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, suggests that the way we form bonds in childhood profoundly shapes how we engage in relationships as adults. The attachment patterns we develop with our primary caregivers become the templates we use to navigate love, intimacy, and connection. In other words, the way you were loved or not loved as a child influences the way you seek love as an adult. It shapes who you are attracted to and how you respond to them when they show up in your life. If you grew up with a caregiver who was emotionally unavailable or inconsistent, you may find yourself attracted to partners who mirror that same emotional distance. You may crave closeness, but find it difficult to allow yourself to truly trust someone because deep down, you've learned that closeness often brings pain, not security. You may want affection, but feel uneasy when it is offered, because love has always felt like something to chase, something to earn, something unpredictable. On the other hand, if you were raised in an environment where love felt constant and secure, you may be drawn to relationships where emotional availability feels natural, where connection feels easy. But even here, you may still carry the unconscious expectation that love will be unconditional, without the ability to recognize when love crosses into unhealthy patterns of dependency or boundarylessness. We often hear people say, "I keep attracting the wrong type of person." And while it may seem like bad luck, the truth is more nuanced. The relationships you find yourself in are not random. They are often reflections of your own attachment style, a reflection of what feels familiar, and in some cases, a reflection of what feels safe, even if it's unhealthy. Familiarity becomes a form of comfort. Even in chaos, there is an underlying sense of predictability, and that predictability makes it easier to stay in relationships that reinforce old, unexamined patterns. So why do we stay in these relationships? Why do we find ourselves continually choosing the same people, even when we know the outcome? Because attachment is powerful. The desire to connect, to be loved, to feel needed. These are fundamental human needs, woven into the very fabric of our being. We seek these things not just for validation, but for survival. Attachment gives us a sense of security, a sense of belonging, even if the way it comes to us is distorted. There's a quiet kind of comfort in the known, even when that known is painful. It feels safer to stay within the boundaries of the emotional chaos we're used to than to risk stepping into the unknown, where love feels stable, predictable, and secure. Because even though the drama of the same old relationships is exhausting, it's a kind of exhaustion we've learned to live with. It becomes part of who we are, and to let go of it means letting go of something we've held on to for so long. We hold on to the familiar, even when it doesn't serve us. We continue to attract the same types of people because deep down, it feels like the only kind of love we know. But here's the truth. You don't have to keep repeating these patterns. The first step is recognizing them. When you understand how your attachment style shapes the relationships you attract, you begin to open up the possibility for change. You begin to see that the relationships you seek are not random, but a reflection of what you've learned about love, about trust, about intimacy. And once you see it, you can begin to break free from the cycle. You can start choosing a different path, one that is not governed by the pull of familiarity, but by the awareness of what you truly need in love. The roots of your attachment style run deep. They are not born overnight, but are planted in the earliest years of your life, in the interactions, or lack thereof, with the people who were meant to care for you. From the moment you are born, your brain and your body are absorbing the emotional environment around you, the warmth of touch, the consistency of affection, the presence of care. These early experiences shape the lens through which you will later view love, trust, and connection. Attachment theory tells us that our relationships with our primary caregivers, the people who first taught us how to love and be loved, form the foundation of the attachment styles we carry into adulthood. These caregivers, whether parents, guardians, or others, teach us not only how to interact with them, but how to interact with the world. Their actions, their availability, their emotional responses, all create the framework for how we will later relate to others. When caregivers are consistent in their love and nurturing, we develop a secure attachment. We learn that we are worthy of love, that it is safe to rely on others, and that we can form deep, trusting connections. We begin life with the understanding that we can both give and receive love freely without fear of abandonment or rejection. This secure foundation makes it easier to navigate relationships as we grow older because we are not constantly seeking reassurance or validation from others. We trust that love will be there, and we trust that we are enough as we are. But what if your early experiences were different? What if love was inconsistent, conditional, or absent altogether? If caregivers were emotionally unavailable or erratic, you may develop an anxious attachment style, where love is sought out desperately, but never fully felt. You may have learned that love is something you must chase, something that ebbs and flows in unpredictable ways. As a child, you may have cried for attention, hoping to be seen and heard, only to feel ignored or dismissed. In adulthood, this attachment style often plays out in relationships where you crave closeness, but constantly fear rejection. You find yourself drawn to people who are emotionally distant or unreliable because on some level that feels familiar, even though it brings pain. Alternatively, if your caregivers were dismissive, emotionally distant, or neglectful, you may develop an avoidant attachment style, one where emotional distance is the only way to cope with love. You may have learned that it's safer to keep your emotions hidden, to rely only on yourself, because those who were supposed to care for you couldn't be trusted with your vulnerability. As an adult, you might find yourself pushing people away, resisting closeness, preferring emotional independence to emotional intimacy. Relationships may feel like a burden, and you may avoid emotional vulnerability even when you want connection. because intimacy feels risky, unpredictable, and uncomfortable. Then, there is the disorganized attachment style, often the result of unpredictable or traumatic early experiences with caregivers. When caregivers are both a source of comfort and a source of fear, a child can develop disorganized attachment, a style where love and safety are both sought and feared. These individuals may struggle to form coherent patterns of connection, fluctuating between clinginess and detachment. They may feel both a deep longing for love and an overwhelming fear of it, caught in a cycle of confusing emotional responses. As adults, they may attract relationships that mirror this chaos, a cycle of emotional push-pull that leaves them feeling confused, anxious, and unfulfilled. The attachment style you develop as a child doesn't just affect your ability to connect with others, it affects how you see yourself. A securely attached child learns that they are worthy of love, that they deserve care and attention. But when love is inconsistent or absent, a child learns the opposite, that they are not worthy of unconditional love, that they must earn affection, that they must adapt to others' emotional needs at the expense of their own. These early experiences shape your sense of self, your self-worth, and your belief in your ability to give and receive love in a healthy, balanced way. And so, you move through life with these deeply ingrained patterns, attracting people who mirror the emotional lessons of your childhood, even when those patterns are unhealthy. You find yourself repeating the same relational dynamics, searching for something familiar, even when it doesn't serve you. This is the silent pull of attachment, the way it shapes who we are drawn to, how we connect, and what we believe love should look like. Attachment is not just about the other person. It is about how we learn to love ourselves. If we were taught that love is conditional, we may carry that belief into every relationship, feeling unworthy, unseen, or unimportant. But if we were shown that love is steady, consistent, and unconditional, we are more likely to expect and offer that same stability in our adult relationships. This chapter explores how the patterns of attachment we learn as children shape the relationships we form as adults. It is through these early experiences that we begin to understand love, not just as a feeling, but as a foundation upon which we build our emotional world. The next chapter will dive deeper into the scientific and psychological explanations behind how attachment styles influence our behaviors and why we continue to seek out relationships that echo the past. At the heart of attachment theory lies the understanding that our early experiences with caregivers shape the way we form relationships throughout our lives. But what does this really mean on a biological level? How do the emotional dynamics of our childhood affect our behaviors as adults? The science of attachment goes beyond the emotional experience. It delves into how our brains and bodies respond to the love, or lack thereof, we receive during our formative years. Our brains are wired for connection. From the moment we are born, our brains begin to form neural pathways that shape how we understand and interact with the world. The primary caregivers in our early lives, usually our parents, are the first to teach us about trust, safety, and love. Their emotional availability, responsiveness, and consistency create the foundation for how we will engage with others in the future. When caregivers are emotionally responsive, attuned to our needs, and consistently present, our brains develop a sense of safety and trust. This safety is rooted in a chemical process, the release of oxytocin, often referred to as the love hormone, which helps us bond with others. Oxytocin is released during moments of physical affection, like hugging or touching, but it is also released when we experience emotional connection and trust. A child who grows up in a secure attachment environment develops neural pathways that reinforce the belief that they are safe to connect, to love, and to be loved. Secure attachment is the ideal outcome, and it allows us to move through the world with confidence in our relationships. We are able to form stable, healthy bonds, trust others, and engage in intimacy without fear or anxiety. The brain, when formed under these conditions, sees love and connection as a safe and natural part of life. However, when caregivers are inconsistent, emotionally unavailable, or neglectful, the brain begins to form different pathways that are based on the need to survive in an unpredictable environment. In these cases, the brain starts to rely on coping mechanisms that allow us to protect ourselves from emotional harm. If a child experiences neglect or inconsistent care, their brain adapts by becoming hyper-aware of potential emotional threats. The child learns to be on guard, to anticipate rejection, and to crave attention, even if that attention is unpredictable or fleeting. This is where anxious attachment forms. Children with anxious attachment often grow up feeling uncertain about their emotional needs being met. They crave connection and affection, but they are uncertain whether it will be given. This leads to an overactive stress response system where the brain is constantly scanning for signals of love or rejection. As adults, those with anxious attachment may find themselves drawn to relationships where love feels like a constant chase, where the need for reassurance is overwhelming and the fear of abandonment is always present. In contrast, children who grow up with emotionally distant or neglectful caregivers may develop an avoidant attachment style. These children learn that their emotional needs are not going to be met, so they suppress their feelings in order to protect themselves from disappointment. They become self-reliant, developing the belief that love is something to avoid rather than embrace. The brain, in this case, forms pathways that reinforce the need for emotional distance, for keeping feelings hidden, for managing stress and vulnerability on one's own. As adults, those with avoidant attachment often find themselves uncomfortable with intimacy, resistant to emotional closeness, and unsure of how to truly connect with others without feeling overwhelmed or threatened. Then there is the disorganized attachment style, which often arises from chaotic or abusive early childhood environments. Children with disorganized attachment experience a constant tug-of-war between the need for connection and the fear of it. Their caregivers may have been sources of both comfort and fear. The child never knows whether their parent will be loving or harmful. This leads to a sense of confusion, a lack of coherence in how they respond to emotional intimacy. As adults, those with disorganized attachment often find themselves in relationships that mirror this chaos. Relationships where they both long for connection and fear it simultaneously. Their behavior may feel erratic, moving between emotional closeness and emotional distance, caught in a cycle of emotional instability. These attachment styles are not set in stone. While they are formed in childhood, they can evolve over time. The brain is plastic. It can change and adapt based on new experiences. A person who has experienced insecure attachment in childhood can begin to form healthier attachments through self-awareness, therapy, and new, more stable relationships. But the first step in this process is understanding how attachment patterns were formed, how they shape our emotional responses, and how they influence the relationships we seek as adults. This chapter explores the science behind attachment styles, the neural pathways, the emotional responses, and the chemical processes that shape the way we connect with others. By understanding the origins of attachment, we gain insight into why we are drawn to the same patterns in relationships, why we repeat the same emotional dynamics, and why certain types of love feel familiar, even when they are not healthy. Recognizing these patterns is the first step in breaking the cycle. Once we understand the root causes, we can begin the process of healing, rewiring our attachment responses, and learning to form healthier, more secure connections. The patterns we repeat in relationships often feel as though they are outside of our control. We may find ourselves repeatedly drawn to people who embody the same qualities, the same emotional distance, the same fleeting moments of affection that we once experienced in childhood. Despite our best efforts to break free from these patterns, we continue to attract the same type of person, the same kind of love. But these patterns are not accidental. They are woven into the fabric of our emotional lives, shaped by our early attachments and unconsciously reinforced by the way we engage with others. When we think of patterns, we often imagine repetitive behaviors or actions that we cannot seem to change. But at the heart of these patterns lies an emotional need, the need to recreate what feels familiar. Even when we consciously desire a healthier, more stable relationship, we may still find ourselves choosing partners who mirror the same emotional dynamics we grew up with. Why? Because at some deep level, these emotional dynamics feel safe, even though they are unhealthy. For example, someone with an anxious attachment style may find themselves attracted to a partner who is emotionally distant, someone who is inconsistent in their affection. This person may crave closeness and reassurance, but the partner's emotional distance, though painful, feels familiar. It feels like the love they once knew, even if it came with hurt. The anxious person might try harder to get closer, to win the love, but the cycle repeats. The need for validation becomes stronger and the distance grows. On the other hand, someone with an avoidant attachment style may be drawn to a partner who is needy, who seeks constant affection and attention. This partner's emotional demands may feel overwhelming, but they offer the avoidance person a sense of control. In this dynamic, emotional intimacy becomes something to resist, something to escape from, because deep down, the avoidant person believes that vulnerability is a threat that was learned early in life. They push away, they create distance, and the cycle continues. These repetitive patterns are not about choosing the wrong people. They are about choosing what is familiar. We are often drawn to relationships that reflect the emotional environment we grew up in, even if those relationships are damaging. The subconscious mind, always seeking comfort in the known, guides us back to what feels emotionally safe, even if it is unhealthy. We repeat these patterns because they reinforce the familiar, even though that familiarity often brings pain. But it is not just the other person who reinforces these patterns. We also play a part in continuing the cycle. Our attachment styles guide our emotional responses, our fears, and our expectations in relationships. For example, someone with an anxious attachment style may become excessively preoccupied with their partner's feelings, constantly seeking reassurance, even when it is not warranted. They may send texts, make excessive calls, or display behaviors that keep them emotionally tethered to their partner. This behavior can cause the partner to withdraw even further, reinforcing the anxious person's fear of abandonment. The anxious person is unconsciously choosing to remain in a cycle of anxiety and reassurance, a cycle that feels familiar, but is ultimately exhausting. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, the pattern often involves emotional distancing, withdrawing at the first sign of intimacy or emotional vulnerability. The avoidant person may push away affection, resist commitment, and keep their emotions at arm's length because closeness feels like a threat to their autonomy. But in doing so, they often create a sense of emotional isolation, reinforcing their belief that they cannot rely on others for emotional support. Both the anxious and the avoidant attachment styles struggle with their own emotional needs. The anxious person wants love, but fears it will be withheld. The avoidant person wants love, but fears it will suffocate them. These internal contradictions play out in the relationships they form. The anxious person will try to pull closer, and the avoidant person will push away. The cycle repeats, and no one breaks free. So why do we continue these patterns? Part of it lies in our desire to fulfill unmet emotional needs. The relationships we attract are often an attempt to heal the wounds of our past, even if those relationships are not the healthiest. We may unconsciously seek out the same emotional dynamics that we experienced in childhood, hoping that this time, this person will be the one to meet our needs, to give us the love we have always longed for. But when we are caught in these cycles, we often fail to realize that we are not choosing the wrong people, but rather we are choosing the familiar people, those who embody the same emotional patterns we have known all our lives. Breaking free from these patterns requires first understanding them, seeing the cycles we repeat, and how our attachment styles influence the way we engage in relationships. It is only when we recognize these patterns that we can begin to create healthier relational dynamics, relationships where we are not unconsciously trying to heal the wounds of the past, but forming new, secure, and balanced connections. But first, we must acknowledge the pull of the familiar and allow ourselves the courage to step outside of the emotional patterns that have kept us locked in a cycle of repetition. The moment you begin to recognize the patterns in your relationships, you may feel both a sense of clarity and confusion. It's as if you can see the emotional script you've been following all along, yet still find yourself tangled in the lines. There is a quiet resistance that rises when we confront these patterns, a part of us that wants to break free from the emotional cycles, but a part of us that is also deeply afraid to do so. You may begin to feel the pull of two opposing forces inside you. On one hand, there is the desire to break free, to step out of the cycle of attracting people who mirror the same emotional struggles. You want to experience love in a way that feels healthy, secure, and fulfilling. You want to feel valued and supported without the fear of abandonment, without the need to chase affection or push it away. This desire for change is strong. It feels like a longing for freedom, for a new beginning, for emotional peace. But on the other hand, there is the fear. The fear that stepping away from these familiar emotional dynamics means stepping into the unknown. You may find comfort in the chaos, even if it brings pain, because it is what you've known for so long. The unknown feels scarier than the pain you already carry. If you stop chasing love in the same way, if you stop pulling away when it feels too close, what will you be left with? Is there love outside of this pattern? Is there a way to love without the emotional turbulence you've come to accept as normal? The internal conflict between the desire for change and the fear of change is palpable. It is a tug of war between what your heart wants and what your mind fears. The heart wants love, real, authentic love, but the mind is conditioned by years of attachment dynamics that were formed in childhood. These dynamics feel safe, even when they are painful. They are familiar, and familiarity often feels like security, even when it leaves you emotionally drained, unfulfilled, and lost. The difficulty with attachment patterns is that they are not simply habits. They are deeply ingrained emotional responses. These responses were formed over years of living with certain emotional experiences, and they become automatic. When you feel neglected, you reach for reassurance. When you feel overwhelmed by affection, you pull back. These responses are so deeply embedded in your nervous system that they feel like reflexes. You may not even realize that you are acting from this emotional script until you start to see it from a distance. And this is where the conflict deepens. Even when you begin to see these patterns for what they are, there is a part of you that resists change. There is a quiet voice that tells you that maybe, just maybe, the chaos is a necessary part of love, that real intimacy can only be found through the highs and lows. But another voice, a quieter voice, reminds you that true love is not about surviving chaos. It is about creating balance. It is about vulnerability without fear, closeness without anxiety, intimacy without shame. But the fear remains, rooted in the belief that love without the intensity of these emotional highs and lows is not love at all. How can you have love without the feeling of longing, without the fear of losing it, without the rush of chasing and retreating? How can you feel emotionally connected without the drama that seems to define connection? This is where the inner conflict lives, between the longing for something better and the fear of losing what you know. To break free from the patterns, you must first challenge the beliefs that sustain them. You must challenge the belief that love is only real if it hurts, that intimacy is only real if it is difficult. You must begin to question the narrative that emotional chaos is a sign of depth, and that peace is a sign of emotional emptiness. The resistance to change is not just about fear, it is also about identity. If your attachment style has defined how you connect with others for most of your life, it becomes part of who you are. You may begin to wonder, if I change the way I love, if I let go of these patterns, who will I be? The fear of losing your emotional identity can be just as strong as the fear of vulnerability itself. But this is the quiet truth that many people with insecure attachment styles come to realize. You are not defined by the patterns you repeat, but by your ability to recognize them and choose differently. Breaking free from these patterns requires embracing the discomfort of change. It requires facing the fear of emotional intimacy without the chaos, the fear of connection without the distance. But it also requires a deep trust in yourself, a trust that you are capable of forming relationships that are healthy, stable, and fulfilling. The discomfort is temporary. What awaits on the other side is the possibility of a love that isn't tainted by fear, a love that is built on understanding, trust, and mutual respect. This chapter explores the internal conflict that arises when we begin to challenge our attachment patterns. It is the struggle between what we know and what we want to become. It is the fear of stepping into a new way of loving and the courage it takes to let go of the emotional habits that no longer serve us. In recognizing this conflict, we take the first step toward healing and toward creating a new emotional identity. There comes a moment, small and almost imperceptible, when you realize that you are stuck in a pattern that feels familiar, but not in a good way. It's the moment when you look at your past relationships, or perhaps even your current one, and you suddenly see the same emotional dynamics repeating themselves over and over again. You see the cycle clearly, the push and pull, the chasing and retreating, the longing and the fear. At first, this realization can feel overwhelming. It's as if a veil has been lifted, and you are finally able to see what was always in front of you but went unnoticed. You may feel a sense of confusion. How did you end up here again? Why are you repeating the same emotional patterns, even when you told yourself you wouldn't? You may feel a deep sense of shame or frustration, wondering why you keep attracting the same kind of person, the same type of emotional chaos, even though you've been seeking something different. But this moment, this turning point, is the beginning of understanding, the beginning of change. It is the recognition that these patterns are not just random, they are rooted in something deep within you. They are connected to your attachment style, the emotional blueprint you've carried with you since childhood. And this realization, as painful as it may be, is the first step in breaking the cycle. Because now you can see it for what it is, a pattern. And patterns, no matter how deeply ingrained, can be changed. This turning point is not a sudden shift. It is a gradual awareness, a moment of self-reflection. It is the quiet understanding that the relationships you've been seeking, the ones that mimic your emotional history, are not the ones that will bring you peace or fulfillment. But in recognizing this, you also begin to understand that you have the power to change. You have the power to rewrite the narrative that has been playing out in your relationships, the power to choose a different path. At this moment, you may feel both a sense of liberation and fear. The fear is understandable. The familiar feels safe, even when it brings pain. It feels like something you can control, even though it may be causing you harm. There is a comfort in the known, in the emotional dynamics you've learned to navigate over the years. Letting go of the familiar, of the emotional patterns that have become a part of your identity, can be frightening. It is a leap into the unknown, a space where love can be different, where it can be more secure, more balanced, and more fulfilling. But there is also liberation in this turning point. Because once you see the pattern, you begin to see that it is not your fault. It is not a reflection of your worth, but a result of your attachment style and the unconscious choices you've made based on what you've learned about love. The realization that you are not doomed to repeat the same patterns, that you have the ability to choose differently, is a powerful moment. It is the recognition that you are not a prisoner of your past. You are someone who can break free and create new ways of relating to others. The turning point is also about self-compassion. When you begin to recognize the pattern, you may initially feel shame or frustration. But it's important to remember that these patterns were not formed out of weakness or inadequacy. They were formed out of a deep emotional need for connection, a need to be loved, a need to feel safe. They are coping mechanisms that were developed to help you navigate the complexities of love, even when love was unpredictable or inconsistent. And in acknowledging this, you can begin to let go of the shame and move toward healing. This turning point is also a moment of empowerment. You now know that the relationships you attract are not random. They are a reflection of what you have learned about love, what you have learned about yourself, and what you have learned about your worth. And when you understand this, you realize that you can choose differently. You can rewrite your emotional narrative. You can form relationships that are grounded in security, trust, and mutual respect. The key to breaking the cycle is not in trying to force a new pattern, but in becoming aware of the old one. Once you recognize the pattern, you can begin to choose relationships that align with your true needs, the ones that offer balance, support, and healthy emotional intimacy. The turning point is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of something new. It is the moment when you stop repeating the same mistakes and start creating new, healthier ways of loving. Healing from the patterns of attachment we've carried for so long is not a process of erasure, but of transformation. It is not about forgetting the emotional lessons of the past, but about rewriting the way we connect with others, breaking free from old patterns that no longer serve us, and learning to form healthier, more secure bonds. The first step in healing is the quiet recognition that these patterns do not define you. They are the product of your experiences, your upbringing, and the emotional responses you develop to cope with love and connection. But they do not have to continue shaping your relationships. The key to breaking the cycle is awareness, understanding that you can choose differently, that you can break free from the patterns that have kept you locked in emotional uncertainty. Awareness is the first step toward healing, and it is the foundation upon which new relational patterns can be built. Healing also begins with self-compassion, the understanding that you are not broken, but simply human. The attachment patterns you have carried were never about your inadequacy or your worth. They were survival strategies, ways of coping with emotional needs that were not always met. And while those strategies may have served you in the past, they no longer need to dictate your future. The practice of self-compassion is learning to be kind to yourself, to forgive yourself for the times you've fallen into old patterns, and to give yourself permission to start again. It is the quiet acceptance that healing is a journey, one that requires patience, understanding, and gentleness toward yourself. To begin rewiring your attachment responses, it's important to create new emotional experiences. Healing happens not just through reflection, but through lived experience. It is about finding relationships that reflect the healthier attachment patterns you want to embody. Relationships that are based on mutual respect, emotional security, and trust. If you've experienced anxious attachment, seek out relationships where emotional consistency and security are present. If you've experienced avoidant attachment, allow yourself to be vulnerable with people who are trustworthy, who understand and respect your boundaries while encouraging closeness. If you've experienced disorganized attachment, find relationships where emotional stability and calm are possible. Relationships where you can learn to trust love without fear. But rewiring attachment is not just about others. It is about learning to build a secure relationship with yourself. This means giving yourself the emotional stability you've always sought in others. It is about self-soothing, creating emotional space where you can calm yourself, validate your own feelings, and meet your own emotional needs. Self-soothing is not about suppressing emotions. It is about acknowledging them without judgment, recognizing that your feelings are valid, and that you are worthy of compassion, especially from yourself. Healing is also about learning to trust again, not just in others, but in your own ability to navigate love. It is about trusting that love can be steady, that connection can be secure, that intimacy doesn't have to come with fear. This process requires that you challenge your fears. The fear of abandonment, the fear of being smothered, the fear of vulnerability. Each time you lean into a relationship with trust, you begin to heal the wounds of the past. Each time you allow someone in, without the weight of old emotional baggage, you begin to rewrite your story of attachment. Healing also requires you to set healthy boundaries. In the past, attachment patterns may have caused you to ignore your needs or overextend yourself emotionally. Healing is about understanding that your emotional needs are just as important as anyone else's, and that you have the right to set boundaries that protect your well-being. Setting boundaries doesn't mean pushing people away. It means knowing what you need emotionally and being able to communicate that to others. It is about finding balance in your relationships, where love can flow freely, without fear, without manipulation, without the anxiety that comes from unspoken expectations. The journey toward rewiring your attachment responses is not a quick fix. It is a gradual, ongoing process of self-discovery, of learning to love yourself and others in healthier, more secure ways. It is about taking small, steady steps toward the kind of love you truly deserve, the kind that doesn't leave you anxious or withdrawn, the kind that feels steady, grounded, and fulfilling. As you move through this journey, you will begin to see the people and relationships you attract shift. You will find that love doesn't have to be chaotic to be real. It doesn't have to be full of highs and lows to be meaningful. Love can be steady, secure, and nurturing. And as you heal and grow, you will learn to expect and give this kind of love, both to yourself and to others. This chapter closes with a quiet understanding. Healing is possible. The patterns of attachment that have guided your relationships up until now are not permanent. You have the power to change, to grow, and to create new, secure connections, ones that reflect the love, trust, and intimacy you truly deserve. And in that process, you will come to see that the greatest love of all, the love that can transform your life, is the love you give yourself. And with that, you will begin to attract the relationships that truly align with your healthiest, most authentic self.